Hello again, art history students. Welcome to lecture 1 of week 1. So this is basic styles of art. There are 3 little video lectures in this sort of section. There will be the basic styles of art, and then the principles and elements of design, and then types of analysis, which is one of my favorite lectures to give. So this is a really foundational kind of beginning week. It's a lot of terminology, some terminology that you may know and some that you may not. And the idea is just to familiarize you with how we talk about art visually and also how we talk about art in its context. So in like the art history or historical perspective. This week is not chronological. From here on, things will start to move in a chronological order and sort of arranged by geography a little bit. So this week, these 3 little lectures are not at all chronological or anything like that. And you'll see that as we go through, but it's like getting you to understand some main ideas. With all that being said, let's go ahead and begin. All right, so what is art and why would you study it? So I know quite a few of you are maybe thinking to yourself, well, I'm taking this class because I need that general elective to tick off for my, my degree. But art is a visual language that I would personally argue can convey more than written or verbal language. We've all heard that colloquial saying, a picture's worth 1,000 words. I think that holds very true. So learning about art and learning about it in its context overlaps all of the other disciplines, the humanities and the sciences. This is a language, art is that visual language that's about what people see. And it's very easy to use any of this terminology and any of this language that we're going to learn about and overlap it with other things and other things that you study. So hopefully this class might bring greater understanding to some other things that you're exploring in your education. All right, so the impulse for art. So we know that no human society has ever lived without some form of art, and the ability to make art is uniquely human. Now, you may have seen YouTube videos of like an elephant that paints with its trunk or a dog that runs around in various colors of paint, and it's sort of like animals creating art. I would argue that that is not the same thing. There is this very clear communication that humans are having. It's a human-to-human communication that they're trying to get across. And also sort of like this slight power over a situation. If you understand a situation, there's sort of like this power that goes with that. And we'll talk more about that in a moment. But this is a uniquely human thing. Okay. So this is the first artwork that we're going to look at. This is the replica of the springing horse. It dates from the Upper Paleolithic period in Europe. It is a very, very early work of art, but as you'll learn next week when we talk about prehistoric art, it is by far not the first. So if you're thinking to yourself, well, what is this thing? You may be familiar with this and not even know it. What this is it's an atlatl. If you've ever used that stick that throws a tennis ball really, really far for your dog when you're playing fetch, you know what one I'm talking about. It's kind of like the ball clicks in, and then when you throw with it, you throw like way farther than your muscles in your body could ever launch the tennis ball, and your dog's like so excited and runs so far. So that's essentially what this object is. It's used for throwing spears, not for throwing tennis balls, and it's called an atlatl. So what makes this artwork so special is that it has this image of this horse carved onto it. So this would have taken the person who created this artwork time and energy to create such a beautiful little horse carved there on the end. That image does not help this object function, right? This object is a tool. It was used for hunting, right, to throw your spear and whatnot, or I guess possibly for protection, but more than likely for hunting. But it has this horse on it. And if you think about it, a horse is part of the visual culture of the Paleolithic people. They would have seen horses running very fast and very far, right? Which is what you want your spear to do in this Paleolithic moment when you would be throwing that spear. So it's this connection between something that you see, something that's in your visual culture, and attributes that that thing has, and wanting those attributes to be added to something else, right? So this is a tool. Like I said before, the image of this horse does not in any way affect the function of the tool. It's a symbolic pairing, right? And that's one of the things that makes this artwork uniquely human and uniquely trying to use the visual language and the visual culture of the people who made it to communicate something. So it can be argued whether or not that communication is trying to happen between, the object and the person who's using it, or this art object and potentially even the spear, right? Trying to kind of create this power, this linkage between this fast horse and this fast spear, right? Trying to put those together. So this is a very, very uniquely human thing. And I think this artwork kind of really identifies some of the points I brought up in the previous slide. All right. So I used one of those vocabulary words there in that last little section, and art is always going to be part of the wider context of when it was created. And a visual culture is all the images that we encounter, right? So if I were to make an atlatl for hunting today, right, and I would want to select something that moves very fast and is very powerful, I might choose like a muscle car or something, right? Because that's part of my visual culture. That obviously wouldn't be part of the visual culture of Paleolithic man in Europe. So that's why he chose the horse. It was part of his visual culture. And one thing I also want to note out is that art reflects the visual culture in which it was created and not just the creative achievements of its maker. So even though that atlatl with the springing horse on it is very well crafted and carved, it's not just about that artist who made that. It's part of that culture and that visual culture that it is part of. Kind of sounded a little redundant, but let's move on. All right, so back to the basic styles of art. I want you to look at these three artworks. I haven't provided you with any information about them yet. And I want you to think about and take a guess of what they have in common. Now they all look very different, but what is the one underarching theme that they all have in common? I'll give you a second. All right. So there are 4 basic styles of art listed here. This word trompe-l'oeil is sort of a subsection, a subset underneath of representational art. So we're going to talk about that here in just a minute, but I want you guys to know these 4 basic styles of art. So first is representational. It's art that depicts recognizable figures and objects in a realistic way, right? It's very like photographs. So this is an example of the equestrian statue of Marcus Aurelius from Roman times, right? It's a very realistic representation of what Marcus Aurelius looked like, what his body is in proportion to that horse's body, right? Everything is very representational and realistically depicted. Frederick Edwin Church's Niagara is a very realistic representational depiction of water moving over Niagara Falls. This is another representational example. So this is Johannes Vermeer, Girl with a Pearl Earring. So we're seeing examples of representational that span both painting and sculpture and all these other things. But what they have in common is that they're all realistically representing what they're depicting. So trompe-l'oeil is sort of a subset or a subsection underneath of representational. And it's an extreme kind of illusion that was meant to deceive the viewer, right? So this is a very early example. This is a vanitas. It's a still life with a glass globe, and it has this sort of reflection of the artist painting it. So it's sort of like this very incredibly extreme kind of illusion. And as time has progressed, trompe-l'oeil has changed. This is another example of sort of a trompe-l'oeil, right? So this sort of coming out. Trompe-l'oeil often has a kind of lightheartedness or fun to it, right? It's sort of this little practical joke kind of thing. Don't take that as too much of the description of it. That's not really like the definition, but oftentimes they kind of go hand in hand. This is Jeff Koons' rabbit. This is a very contemporary example of trompe-l'oeil. So what makes this trompe-l'oeil is its material. So it looks like one of those balloons that you would get if you were at a birthday party or going to the hospital or something like that. It almost looks like you could squeeze it and the air would move around inside of it, especially at those ears. But then when you look at the material, this is crafted from stainless steel. So it's very, very hard and very literally exactly the opposite of the soft, air-filled balloons. So that's kind of another way that trompe-l'oeil, there's kind of this deception, this kind of fooling you. All right, the next of the four basic styles of art that we're going to talk about is stylized. And this is art that represents objects realistically, but yet they're exaggerated in a way that emphasizes certain aspects of the object. So here we have Madonna, we have the Pieta, which is Mary and Jesus after he's brought down from the cross. But we can see that their heads and their arms are very exaggerated. The bodies are completely distorted. They're not realistically depicted. They've been exaggerated for that emotional response. Let's look at some more examples. This is the Great Wave off the shore of Kanagawa. And in the background, you can kind of see Mount Fuji, right? So these waves have this like very menacing claw-like ends to them, right? There's this danger that you can kind of see and perceive from those waves. And that's intentional. That's part of how they've been depicted. That little foam at the end of the wave is exaggerated to show that danger. All right, this is the journey of the sun god Ra, right? So this was one of those examples, and this also depicts water. So we have this boat here. You can kind of see it, and it's resting on the water. I don't know if you can see that line. And then we have this nice smooth rhythm going down here, this up and down waves that's happening, right? So this water is very different than that large, the waves off the shore of Kanagawa that we just looked at, right? This is like a slow-paced wave, right? That's moving gently and pushing that boat along, which has the sun god Ra. So his journey is much smoother, right, through the water than, say, the other depictions of water that we just saw. We're going to take that image out. All right. Not the last, but the third, the next basic style of art that we're going to talk about is abstract. So this is art that departs from its recognizable images and is oversimplified. It's distorted, exaggerated, and almost unrecognizable. So if you want to think about it like a spectrum where representational is on one side and abstract is on the other, and then stylized is kind of this moving in the middle between the two. So this is another example of sort of like mother and child together, but they don't really have any distinct bodies. They're just sort of this one sort of piece together. So very much so moving away from that representational image. This is Louise Nevelson's White Vertical Water, right? So this is a depiction of water moving rapidly downwards, similar to like a waterfall like Niagara Falls. So if you look at it, you see that it's like 18 feet high, right? So that's like just as tall, somewhere around a 2-story building, right? So if you could imagine being in a gallery and seeing this artwork and how it would tower over you like a house, you could get that feeling of the water as it comes down. And that's what Louise Nevelson is trying to convey to you. And that's what, so it's more depictions of water in various ways. All right, this is Georgia O'Keeffe. This is another abstract work of art. This is Georgia O'Keeffe's Pink and Blue #2. So Georgia O'Keeffe was kind of famous for depicting flowers from this very abstract perspective. So it's almost like if you were a bee and you were going down into the flower, what you would kind of see or experience inside of there. At least that's how I think about it. You could think about it in many different ways, and that's part of the point that Georgia O'Keeffe is trying to make, right? So it's this looking at something that is recognized. Once I told you that it's a flower, it's kind of recognizable, but it's very much so removing a lot of that information. All right, the last of the 4 is sort of outside of the category. Like we said, we can kind of think of representational, stylized, and abstract as like a spectrum. And then outside of that spectrum is non-objective, or I might refer to it sometimes as non-representational. That's what I was taught when I was a student. But non-objective art does not come from source material. It does not come from the idea of depicting a mother and child. It does not come from the idea of depicting water or anything like that. It is purely about the principles and elements of design, purely about the image, right? So this is Infinity from 1967. Also, just to note, non-objective art is kind of new in the art world. For most of history, art has been about communicating something, communicating ideas. So representational things and having that source material was important for that communication. And it's not till very recently is relative term, that artists have been trying to not come from source material. This is another non-objective example. This is Mark Rothko's #5, #22, right? This is from 1950. So there is no source material for that. And what this artwork is about is the difference between the colors, right? So we have this one body of color, and then this central body of color, and then this lower one. So what Mark Rothko and a lot of the artists from this specific time frame in the 1950s were thinking about was how everyone would see this artwork the same, regardless of your past, regardless of your socioeconomic status, regardless of your culture or history. Everyone would sort of experience this artwork the same. We're going to talk much more about that much later in the class, and sort of the pros and cons, and did they achieve that goal? Did they not? Was that goal silly to begin with? But that's sort of part of what this artist specifically was trying to do with non-objective art. All right, so we're going to play a game. We're going to talk together. So I want you to say, is this one up here, right, that we're looking at, is that representational, stylized, or non-objective, abstract? What is that? What's this one? And then what's this one, right? So that might appear on the quiz, maybe, maybe not. Very likely, maybe not. So you should know what those are. All right, aesthetics. This is another vocabulary word that I'm busting out in the first lecture to you guys. So we're going to hear this word quite a bit. And this is very much an umbrella term. So aesthetics is technically a branch of philosophy, and it deals with what we like and why we like it, right? So when it comes to the art world, it has like a sub meaning. So let's back up for a second. So there are certain sensory experiences that you like. You have a music aesthetic, right? Whatever that is. And your music aesthetic may vary from your friend's music aesthetic. If you've heard this word before, you may have heard it in the context of like home renovation, right? If you've ever watched one of those home makeover TV shows, they say things like, we're redoing the kitchen in a country kitchen aesthetic, right? That's kind of like the term that you may or may not be most familiar with this from. So in art, we're going to use this term a lot, and it has a lot of deeper meanings. Sometimes artworks are grouped by their aesthetic, by what their similarities are, or the sensory experiences that you get from looking at them, right? That's some of what is grouping representational, stylized, abstract, and non-objective artwork. Part of what's grouping them is their aesthetic similarities. So, moving on. All right, these are the key terms, whatever. These are the key terms for this lecture. If you have any questions about them, please do not hesitate to email me, contact me. You may want to, when you're taking the little quiz, you may want to bring this slide up and pause here so that way you know what key terms there will be. But there will probably, very likely, 100% be questions on the quiz about these. So good luck. I'll see you in the next video.